my secret, just do something that ain't nobody ever done before, but make it sound like something that's always been there forever.
Hey TFALs, Joe here. Last October, I was able to interview my former advisor in grad school, Dr. Vicente Rafael, while he was in town giving a talk at USC. We talked briefly about his career, then discussed various political and academic issues pertaining to the Filipino Americans. Unfortunately, my recorder stopped recording about 5 minutes before the end of the interview. Not sure what happened, but I didn't realize it until it was too late. I gave a brief synopsis of the rest of the interview at the end of the episode. In any case, I hope you enjoy. Hello, welcome to This Filipino American Life, a podcast that explores the nuanced experiences of Filipinos in the United States at iba pa. My name is Joe Bernardo, and I'm solo today. I'm here to interview my former advisor, former mentor at UW, continual intellectual mentor, somebody who I look forward to reading your Facebook posts because I always learn something from them. Professor of History at the University of Washington, Vince Rafael. Welcome.
Hi, Joe.
How you doing?
Good to be here. Good to join you.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Vince is one of those people who you see them talk or see him, you read one of his works, and years later you finally understand what he's actually saying. As the case with me. You know, some of the things I still don't understand, but, you know, I eventually gained to understand them. Yeah. And, he's one of the most brilliant minds in academia, and I'm glad he's here in LA visiting, and get to talk to him a little bit and introduce to the TFAL audience who Vince is.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm happy to engage in this conversation. Anywhere you want to start, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, so let's just start with, you know, your personal life. Where were you born? Yeah. Where'd you grow up?
Yeah. Well, as I was telling you earlier, my situation is a little different from most in the sense that I was born and raised in the Philippines, in Manila, and went to school there, went to college there, and then left to go to the United States for graduate school. And this was back in 1979, so conditions were quite different. Middle of the Cold War. Vietnam War was still raging, in the midst of martial law, all these sort of conjunctural moments that I entered into. And when I came to the United States, it was right in the middle of the presidential campaign of 1979. I still remember how Kennedy was challenging Carter for the Democratic nomination, and he lost. And Carter went against Reagan. As we all know, he was resoundingly defeated. And I remember all my friends threatening to leave for Canada when that happened. So
sounds similar.
Yeah. So it was also, you know, it was the middle of the Reagan recession. It was very, I mean, in some ways, it was a very bleak moment in American history. But I knew or appreciated very little of it at that time because I had just come in. Everything was new to me. Everything was novel. And everything was, in a way, disorienting. I went from a very cosmopolitan city in Manila, population of 10 million, to a very small college town in upstate New York, in Ithaca, where I went to Cornell, where there were probably as many cows as there were people. So, and I'd never experienced winter in my life, so that was quite something. So all these things that worked into sort of forcing me to rethink, not just what am I doing here, but also how do I study the Philippines? How do I think about it when no one seems to be talking about the Philippines? Nobody's, because I was in the Southeast Asia program, but everybody else was doing Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth. And those who were doing Asia were predominantly doing China and Japan, Korea, right? So there's very little attention to the Philippines. And it was a kind of situation where I had to basically invent what I thought, or reinvent what I thought the Philippines was all over again. which in a way was quite liberating. Like I didn't have to be dependent on somebody telling me that this is what I should do, this is what I should research on. It was I was pretty much left on my own to my own devices to conduct my own research projects, to take whatever classes I wanted to, all the while having the Philippines in the background, but not having it as a kind of anchor around my neck. So it was very liberating in that sense. There were also no Filipino Americans, or if there were Filipino Americans, they weren't identifiably Filipino Americans because this was upstate New York. This was not Los Angeles. This was not San Francisco, where the Filipino presence tended to be very, very thin and very spread out. Most of the Filipinos I knew in graduate school were from the Philippines, and they were there on government, various kinds of government scholarships, and then they were going to go back. So there was no sense of rootedness. They were just all passing through. And I myself had really originally no intention to stay. I was going to go back. I was going to teach. And so forth. And as luck would have it, I was offered a job. And the job was at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu.
So you finished your dissertation?
I finished my dissertation in July. By August, I was teaching in Honolulu, which is even stranger because I'd never been to Hawaii. And the first problem I had in Hawaii was I didn't know what to do at the beach because I was never a beach person, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't need to have a tan because I was dark enough. But so that was a kind of baptism of fire. I was forced to teach, or I was expected to teach world history, which I knew nothing about. And so again, another process of reinvention. Again, another process of sort of reimagining, what a certain kind of intellectual life might be in a place like Hawaii, which, as you know, I mean, is a completely different world. Having for the first time to deal with and in a place where most of it's over, 14% of the population is Filipino, right? It's a completely different situation where you had a very pronounced Hawaiian native presence, very strong sovereignty movement, and where the university itself felt very colonial. Right. It was most of the faculty were from the mainland. Many of them were haoles. And then the students were all local. And they'd come to class in flip-flops and everything. And it was like, talking to the natives, right? So it was very colonial. And it was quite an adjustment that I had to make. So how to find a way of teaching that rubbed or that went against the grain of these conditions, right? And would help me and help my students sort of think differently. I did not come with a family, which is also very different from the way most Filipinos came to the United States. I didn't have that kind of, sort of familial comfort, but also familial frustrations that most Filipino Americans talk about, which again was both good and bad. I mean, I had cousins, I had uncles and so forth, but I wasn't close to them. So it always felt like, as a Filipino, I was pretty much on my own. And it took a while to sort of figure out how to make sense of that. And most of it came by way of my teaching and by way of my research. So, yeah.
So you came to Cornell and you wanted to learn under Benedict Anderson.
He was one of the people. And the other person was James Siegel.
Yeah.
And I ended up working with him, with both of them, and with this European intellectual historian named Dominic LaCapra. And that was it, because there were other Southeast Asianists, like in history at that time. The Southeast Asianists did the two Southeast Asianists did Thailand, and the other one did early modern Southeast Asia. So they didn't know much about my interest except tangentially, but I learned an enormous amount from them too. So yeah, so graduate school for me was a great moment of transition and learning, and I'm very, very grateful for that experience.
How did they make you kind of rethink the Philippines, rethink maybe Filipino nationalism?
Yeah. Well, for starters, you're in a place where people are talking about all kinds of other different things. And so the first question you have is, well, so how do I locate myself? How do I situate what I already know in relation to what they know, right? So you had to find a common language for doing that, or at least a kind of lingua franca. that will allow you to address what they're talking about and at the same time express what you're interested in. And that common language ended up being, in a way, critical theory. So it was a time in graduate school when a lot of people were doing critical theory. They were reading a lot of continental theory and Marxism and feminism, and post-colonial theory was just beginning. So it was a very exciting time. People didn't quite know exactly what they were going to do with these things. And so that's how I got really interested in doing a kind of historical work that was informed by these continental critical traditions, because it was a way for me of connecting with what other people are doing and with a larger world. Or it's what some post-colonial theorists have referred to as a sort of deprovincialization of not just of Europe, or provincializing Europe, that is localizing what we think of as Europe and the United States, and at the same time deprovincializing the Philippines, which tends to be, for people in the Philippines and for people committed to a certain kind of nationalist scholarship, the Philippines looks like this sort of bounded, fixed place. And I was more interested in unbinding and unfixing the Philippines and connecting it to other worlds and other ways of thinking. So, yeah.
So along those lines, many Filipino Americans tend to identify themselves as Filipino American without question.
Yeah.
Without kind of understanding the history, and these categories are never fixed.
Yeah.
And they didn't come from a vacuum. So can you at least give us kind of a brief synopsis of intro to nationalism, Filipino nationalism, and how Filipino Americans fit into these categories?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and it probably take us a couple of days to answer that. But the short answer to that is that, first of all, nationalism is a fairly recent invention. Certainly in the case of the Philippines, the Philippine nation didn't really exist until the latter part of the 19th century. Or at least some people would argue, sort of mid 19th century, right? 1860s, 1870s, if you were to historicize it. Before that, the Philippines, of course, was a Spanish colony. Although what was meant by the Philippines is a little sort of unclear, because, of course, the Spaniards never succeeded in colonizing the archipelago. What we know now is the Philippine archipelago. The Spaniards, maybe colonized about a good, at its height, 3/4 of the archipelago. And sizable chunks, the mountains, the southern areas, far-flung islands, the northern parts. A lot of these were basically autonomous. They were free from colonization, right? And so the Spaniards always had a very tenuous hold on this archipelago called the Philippines. But nonetheless, there was a remarkably resilient colonial presence that lasted for 350 years. Now, why is it important to bring this up? I think it's important to bring this up because people tend to forget that before colonization, what existed was really a collection of fairly autonomous societies, barangays, as they're usually called in many places, organized around particular, what you might call chiefs or datus, very similar to what you have in the Pacific and in other parts of island Southeast Asia. But there was nothing remotely like the Philippine nation, right? So the Philippine nation doesn't really come until the 19th century, precisely as a reaction to and as a rebellion against Spanish colonialism. So you could argue that without Spanish colonialism, there wouldn't be a Filipino nation, right? So two things there. One, it's recent invention. Two, the fact that it emerges as a kind of reaction or as a kind of negative formation to the oppressiveness of colonialism, right? And the third point to remember about nationalism and its origins is precisely because it existed in such intimate relationship with colonialism, it could not but continue and absorb the various patterns, the various tendencies, the various orientations of colonialism. So it wasn't strange, for example, that many of the nationalist leaders used Spanish as a common language because it was the only language that they could share. It wasn't uncommon that they began to sort of think of themselves first as Spaniards, as Spanish citizens, and then to adopt sort of Spanish laws, Spanish customs. And the most important aspect of this adoption had to do with the Catholic Church. I mean, to the extent that Filipinos are predominantly Catholic is to the extent that they still carry that colonial legacy, right? Because Catholicism was a major agent in the colonization of Filipinos. So what you get in nationalism, I mean, the most elementary feature of nationalism is it is impure. It is contaminated by the very thing it sought to reject, which is colonialism. That it, despite its promises of emancipation and its promises of liberation, nationalism nonetheless tends to repeat the very colonialism that it has sought to reject. So as a result, today in the Filipino nation, you sort of flash forward, what you get is a Philippine nation that in some ways is yet to decolonize the archipelago. But instead of decolonizing, what's happened is it's tended to recolonize its own people. The state, the Philippine state, exists in some ways in the image of the Spanish and then later on of the American colonial state. And its relationship to the people, just as the relationship of elites who run the state to the people, I think is arguably, you could say, is pretty colonial. Right?
Or sometimes worse.
Or sometimes worse, right? Yeah. So when people say, yeah, we're nationalists, you have to pause and you have to wonder, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that your relationship to the people is one of equality, of egalitarianism? But that's never what nationalism has been. Nationalism has always been one of reestablishing a certain kind of order, reestablishing a certain kind of hierarchy, where it's always the most educated and the wealthiest and the most cultured, so to speak, are in positions of leadership, trying to enlighten and educate those who are below them. So there's always this hierarchy that nationalism, a kind of hierarchy that's inherited from colonialism, that nationalism tries to pull forward. Now that's nationalism in the Philippines. Different story when you come to the United States and North America. Filipino American nationalism it comes from different sources, as different. It emerged under different conditions, right? So, for example, there really isn't a well-formed, well-articulated Filipino American consciousness before World War II, right? So when you read Bolosa and you read the earlier Manong literature, there isn't so much a kind of nationalism that's being evoked. If anything, especially if you read Bolosan today, I mean, the kinds of hardships he confronted came as much from white racists as it did from fellow Filipinos. We're constantly trying to cheat him, steal from him, etc. Right?
The what's it called? The crew bosses. And,
exactly. Yeah, and his fellow Filipinos. Always trying to steal his money or something. So there wasn't that kind of solidarity that you usually associate with nationalism. I don't think Filipino American nationalism really emerges until World War II. With World War II, you see Filipinos joining the U.S. Army, for example, fighting against the Japanese. And I think there's this sense of solidarity that begins there. And it's further heightened by the fact that you have a flood of, not a flood, but certainly large migrations of Filipinos after 1965, the immigration reform in 1965. And Filipinos, many of them who came from the professional classes at a time when the Philippines itself was already independent. So they were already imbued with their own sense of sort of post-colonial nationalism, right? Coming to the United States, starting families, and so forth. But many from that generation, I think from that post-65 generation, many of them came to the United States eager to assimilate. And that desire for assimilation meant that they would try to forget, they would try to erase, or at least minimize Filipino culture, beginning with the language. Right, so there's an enormous amount of tendency to discourage, and I'm sure you probably got this in your household too. This is kind of discouraged.
Well, I was lucky. My Lola was the one who raised me.
Right.
So she taught me Tagalog.
Oh, right. So,
but like my brother and sister,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because the assumption was that Tagalog was not going to be valued in the
Yeah.
larger world. It was going to be an impediment to assimilation. So why even bother?
Yeah.
So there was that disconnection from the Philippines, right? And it wasn't, I think, until the third world strikes,
Yeah.
the 70s, again, very conjunctural, right? So Filipino American nationalism, Asian American sort of activism, black power movement, Chicano power movement, gay liberation, women's liberation, all of these, the Filipino American nationalism emerged in this conjuncture of different resistance movements, right? And the idea was precisely to recover something that people felt had been lost, which is the sense of connection to the Philippines, the sense of being Filipino. That would make Filipino Americans not just connected with other U.S. minorities, but also in some ways stand out as a distinct people, with their own civilization, with their own culture, with their own language. And so this is when you have the beginnings of, attempts to form Asian American studies programs, ethnic studies programs, to insist on Tagalog language courses, and so forth and so on. Finally, a third strand that I think comes, and this comes much pretty much around the same time as the third world liberation movements. A third strand that influences the formation of Filipino American nationalism are the organizing efforts of the communist left. The communist left, who at that time had been in a struggle against the dictatorship, against Marcos. They were anxious to forge alliances with Filipino Americans and to recruit Filipino Americans into sort of larger revolutionary struggle against Marcos. And added that was the fact that many of Marcos's enemies had sought exile in the United States. So there was an anti-Marcos solidarity movement. There were communist organizing among Filipino Americans. So that added another layer to Filipino American nationalism, which is why it's very interesting. Filipino Americans tended to be, in some ways, much more left-wing than most other Asian Americans. And you see this, for example, in Seattle with the KDP, the Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino, which was started precisely by elements of the Communist Party. They very quickly forged alliances with the Black Panthers, for example. And there was a lot of connection between Black Panthers and Filipinos. And when Filipino Americans in the United States began to ally themselves with civil rights movements, began to find common cause with anti-racist feminist movements in the United States, that's when the Communist Party tried to cut them off or tried to discipline them. And that attempt to discipline them was all about saying, no, you should not get involved with domestic matters in the U.S. You should keep yourself focused on revolutionary issues in the Philippines. So that's where you belong, right? And of course, there was this huge struggle, and it ended with a lot of Filipino Americans being very disaffected with the Communist Party, leaving the Communist Party, and forging their own organizations much more directed towards civil rights struggles in the United States, although still sympathetic, of course, with what was going on in the Philippines. And then finally today, it's a very interesting situation today where a lot of Filipino American nationalism, as it were, has shifted. And now I think what you get is a generation of Filipino Americans, maybe two generations, who have forgotten about the 70s and who don't remember the 80s, and so who don't remember the civil rights struggles and so forth. And at the same time, they remain anxious and curious and politically active. And these are the folks, I think, not all of them, but I think some of them, who end up joining these left-wing movements again, these communist organized movements. Although they probably will not agree with me, they probably will say that we're not communists, we're just activists. But the fact remains is that their orientation tends to be towards the Communist Party, and they have been very active. Once again, whether or not you agree with what they stand for, you cannot deny their organizing energy. and their ability to influence Filipino American nationalism today. So you see there are all these waves, in the case of Filipino Americans, begins in World War II, crests in '65, becomes and then ebbs again until you get to the civil rights struggles in the '70s. The rise of third world liberation movements, and then it sort of ebbs and rises, and so there are all these different waves. And right now, I think we're at a moment where, in some ways, it's you could say you might argue it's something old, but it's also something new. Old in a sense that the same players are involved, the same tactics are involved, the same attempts to organize. But new in a sense that the conditions are different, right? You don't have a sort of conjunctural moment the way you had in the 60s and 70s, where Filipinos are connecting with, all these other liberation movements, because all these other for example, there's no connection with Black Lives Matter. There's, except in the most tangential way. And Black Lives Matter is not exactly the same as the Black Power movement. So, it's a different sort of climate that we're in. So, yeah. Yeah.
But there's also Filipino Americans who don't whose activism doesn't go towards like the extreme left. Right?
Of course.
There's also there's folks that are extreme right who.
Oh boy, yeah. That's the other thing that's new. I mean, that condition is new. I think that, and again, a lot of it has to do with changed conditions, where you didn't have the same kind of right-wing movements, or maybe you did, but they weren't as pronounced in the 60s and 70s and 80s and even 90s, whereas today they're absolutely rampant. And now one of the things I suspect is that many, for example, pro-Trump Filipinos begin to learn the right-wing proclivities precisely from watching Fox News. Fox News is probably the single most important purveyor of a certain kind of right-wing ideology that Filipinos are exposed to. And, when they have it on constantly, they begin to parrot the same kind of certainly in my experience with my relatives here, it's like that. They begin to parrot the ideology, the talking points, etc. So you didn't have that. You didn't have cable news. You didn't have this 24-hour
and like
stuff.
left-wing news and right-wing news, like very prominent now.
Yeah. So it's certainly become, Filipino nationalism has certainly, and Filipino identity has certainly, I think, become infinitely more complicated today. Yeah. Even as they have become much more pronounced, they've become much more complicated. So, yeah.
So what do you think of the relationships between, or ties, positioning between Filipinos in the Philippines and Filipino Americans here and Filipinos outside of the world, or outside of the U.S., outside of North America? There's kind of maybe a tenuous relationship.
So
I from your observations.
Yeah, I think it's always been tenuous. I think it's always been tenuous. I mean, from the Philippine side, you have this tendency to sort of think of Filipino Americans. I mean, I don't speak for all Filipinos, of course, but my experience is that Filipino Americans are often seen as failed Filipinos. Failed in what sense? Well, failed in the sense that, they don't know the country's history. They don't speak the language. They act like they're, brown Americans. They're seen as sort of entitled, unreflective of their own privilege, et cetera, right? And so there's a lot of resentment to that. And there's this whole sort of Filipino nationalist tradition that sort of connects Filipino Americans to a kind of colonial takeover. They scoff at Filipino Americans playing basketball, or Filipino Americans in the movies and stuff. It's like, this is just colonial mentality all over again. But this time, it's Filipino Americans rather than white Americans, right? So Filipino Americans are doing the job that white Americans used to do. So there's that part of it. There's that resentment, which is always tinged with envy. Right, because you got to remember the thing about Filipino Americans. Number one is their mobility. Yeah, they go to the Philippines, they stay a while, they eat Filipino food, and then they leave. Yeah, right. That's their privilege.
They don't have to deal with the shit.
They don't have to deal with the shit. Right.
In the Philippines,
very few of them actually go back to stay and live. So some Filipino scholars I know even say there's no such thing as a Filipino American diaspora, because if they were truly diasporic, they'd want to come home. But many of these Filipinos, they come here, they're like tourists, right?
Yeah.
They take what they want and then they leave, right? So there's that attitude, right? For Filipino Americans, I don't know, it's a little more complicated, and I think it's very generational.
Yeah.
Each generation will have a certain kind of relationship to the Philippines. So the older generation, might see the Philippines as properly their homeland. Some of them might want to retire there, go back there. Other Filipinos, of course, who were born in this country or who left at a very young age, have very little memories of the country, don't speak the language, don't follow the news, are not really involved in the culture. Or if they are, they're involved with cultural productions here, not there. They might see the Philippines as something that is sort of in the backdrop, very much in the backdrop.
Romanticized version.
Either a romanticized version or a kind of afterthought. That their primary concern really is with communities here. They're much rooted in communities here. And I don't blame it. It's perfectly understandable. Perfectly understandable. Like, why should you care about the Philippines if the Philippines doesn't care about you, right? So your primary concern is, if you're politically active, for example, supporting civil rights movements here,
workers' rights,
climate change, right? And it's very difficult to do that in the Philippines because you have a completely different political structure, completely different sort of culture of activism in the country. It's very difficult to plug into unless you're from there, you grew up there, you went to the schools there. So that's one of the ways in which Filipino Americans and Filipinos differ. Right. There are other ways. I mean, in my case, I'm really interested, for example, in the divide between Filipino American academics and Filipino academics, right? And there's a sort of recurring sort of misunderstanding, miscommunication, which of course always leads to hostility, between the two. And you've probably heard of some of the instances in Hawaii and various other places, where what you get is Filipino intellectuals who tend not to read Filipino American scholarship. And so what they have are certain stereotypes about what that scholarship is about. Oh, it's all about identity. And then they don't have a context for identity. So, they're thinking about identities largely shaped by sort of white academic liberal discourse, which tends to sort of look down on identity as an obstacle, right, as a stumbling block. Whereas if Filipino American academics are interested in identity, a lot of them usually take identity as a starting point and not as an end point. Right? It never has been that way. It's always a starting point. It's always say, okay, this is who we are, or this is what we've become, then what? Right? Then you move on and talk about other things, right? That's one. And secondly, Filipino American scholarship, especially in the last 15, 20 years. There's a lot of emphasis on intersectionality. What's been called intersectionality. So it's not just about being Filipino X, it's about Filipino, gender, Filipino Americans gender, Filipino Americans sexuality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the second thing. And the third thing is that a lot of Filipino American scholarship is concerned with the empire, particularly the intersection between empire and race, because there's this recognition that the very identity of Filipino-ness and therefore Filipino Americanness is connected to the history of Spanish and American colonialism. Right? You can't talk about Filipino Americans without talking about America. And America, in the experience of Filipinos, begins with the war, Filipino American War and Filipino American Empire, which always gets forgotten in the United States. So it's always a constant battle of reminding people, hey, there was a war. And if we're here, it's because you guys were there, and so forth and so on. And for Filipinos in the Philippines, first of all, the Filipino-American War is an afterthought. I mean, you don't think about the war anymore.
You don't think of yourself as an empire.
And they don't think of the United States, or if they think of the United States as an empire, they think of it as in the most abstract way, right? Filipinos in the Philippines do not have the same experience of racism, for example, that Filipino Americans here have. And this is one of the things I've learned. You move to this country and all of a sudden you're a minority, right? And minority in the most unfortunate, vicious way, in a sense, because your skin color is different, you're treated differently, your accent is different, et cetera, et cetera. In the Philippines, the experience of race tends to be subsumed by the experience of class. right? So if people feel discriminated, it's not because they're dark, or they may be dark, but the most important point is the fact that they're poor. Right, so class tends to take a certain kind of priority where power structures are concerned. You don't have that here. It's race is front and center. So it doesn't matter if you're wealthy. It doesn't matter if you drive a nice car. Brown skin, black skin, Latino skin. I mean, it's we know how that works in this country. Filipinos in the Philippines don't have an appreciation of that, so they don't know the conditions under which Filipino Americans work. So what you get is this, what you might call asymmetrical awareness of one another, right? I think Filipino Americans tend to be much more aware of what's going on in the Philippines, even if they are not as involved, whereas Filipinos tend to have much less awareness and much less sensitivity to what's going on among Filipino Americans. So, and that prevents connections, that prevents coalitions, that prevents understanding.
Is it because of that privilege? Or because of mobility?
Well, as I said, it's two ways. On the one hand, Filipino Americans have this privilege, right, when they come to the Philippines, which then Filipinos tend to resent. On the other hand, I think Filipinos in the Philippines have a certain kind of misunderstanding. And there's a kind of generally a lack of interest in addressing this kind of gap, this kind of misunderstanding. I wouldn't call it a privilege, although I don't know. I mean, I guess you can say, what would be the Filipino privilege? The Filipino privilege is not to have to deal with the problems Filipino Americans have to deal with.
Got it.
And not have to care.
Yeah.
That's a kind of privilege right there. Yeah.
So I know you have to go. I have an appointment soon.
We can keep going. This is fun.
2 days. We have 2 days, right?
This is fun. Yeah.
So I really want to ask you this, because this is what I really appreciate about your scholarship, is that you really tend to look at the kind of nuanced nuances of like power relations.
Yeah.
And in TFAL, we like to say that we explore the nuanced experience of Filipino Americans. In many instances, we talk about Philams, we can't not talk about being marginalized. But things are not so black and white. For example, there are many ways of resistance to oppressive power.
Sure.
Why do you think it's so important to explore kind of that gray area?
Yeah. You mean questions of resistance? Questions of overcoming
different kinds of resistance that are not necessarily like subsumed in kind of a liberal or Marxist type of lens.
Yeah. Well, life is complicated. Life is messy. So people are going to respond to the conditions they're confronted with in all kinds of different ways. When I think that it's a mistake to assume that there's only one way of resisting. And certainly, this is what happens when you become subsumed in a larger sort of organization. And these organizations there's only one way of doing it. I mean, there's so many different ways of doing it. I think in my case, two areas where I've always found these forms of resistance sort of interesting to think about. One is in the area of scholarship, which of course is what I do, and the other is in the area of art. So I'm very interested, for example, in Filipino American art productions, cultural productions, because I think these cultural productions, by the sheer fact that they're experimenting with forms, that they're trying to push forward certain ideas, that they're trying to make arguments, right, about the artist's place in the world, are already forms of resistance. There are ways of asserting certain kinds of life worlds and basically saying that life consists precisely of choosing otherwise, of being otherwise. So you don't have to be stuck, right, in this particular sort of situation you're in. There's, who is it that says other worlds are possible, right? I mean, that's a slogan for some of these political movements now. And I completely concur with that. And there's no place where you can see that most dramatically as in the areas of art, theater, literature, poetry, music, dance, etc. And Filipinos excel in all those areas. My God, I mean, it starts in school. It starts at home, and then in community productions, college, etc. there are all these opportunities that usually it's not given to them. They have to take it, right? So they have to improvise and so forth. And I find that very useful. And then in scholarship, as I said, it is what I try to do in my own work. But I think many other Filipino Americans in their own way are doing that. Every time I talk to Filipino American students, I'm always amazed the kinds of projects they want to pursue. And it begins with curiosity. It begins with, again, asking yourself, this is what we've been told to believe. Is this really the case? Is there another way of thinking?
And this is where the recording stopped. Again, not sure what happened. Probably my fat fingers accidentally pressed the pause button. Anyway, I asked Vince the follow-up question. What about the apolitical Filipino and Filipino Americans who aren't involved politically and shy away from traditional forms of resistance? Is that in itself a form of resistance? By the way, a lot of his scholarship covers this topic. He answers, yes, it's a form of resistance, perhaps the type of resistance that the most affected by oppression tends to rely on to survive on a daily basis. It's a resistance that the liberal and the radical among Filipinos that try to organize communities tend to ignore. So that was kind of the synopsis of his answer to my question. Afterwards, I thanked him and bid farewell. Again, I apologize for missing 5 minutes of this interview. I promise not to fuck it up next time. Actually, I probably will break that promise, but oh well. Anyway, have a great day, T-Pals.
This Filipino American Life is produced by Michael Nailat. Our intro and outro music is by Roger Habon, aka 10.4 Raj. Resident reality checker Girly Colado, legal advisor Rianne Fajardo, and graphic design by Vincent Collyer.